Now, the first rule of cutting boards is knowing what wood to use. Because you're going to be cutting on a cutting board, you want to make sure that you're using a hardwood. And on top of that, there's going to be food on the cutting board. And so you don't want to use wood that could be toxic. So a great rule of thumb is to use any wood that produces fruit or nuts. Now, my preferred choice of wood is either cherry, hard maple, or walnut. Now, there's other types of wood that you can use, but if you're ever not sure, make sure you check. You're also going to want to make sure you buy waterproof wood glue because you don't want your project falling apart 6 months after you make it. And lastly, don't stain your cutting boards. Like I said earlier, you're going to have food on these and you don't want to be ruining your food with just some nasty stain. So I recommend using cutting board oil. I use this walrus oil from my local wood shop. They're not a sponsor, but they're certified, they're safe to use, plant-based ingredients, good stuff. Walrus oil, if you're watching this, hit me up. So if you keep all that in mind, making cutting boards can be extremely fun, and there's not a single one in the world when you make it by hand that is the exact same as yours. So with that, I'm going to show you how to make some cutting boards. The first step to create a cutting board is arguably the most important step, and that is to make sure your table saw blade is as close to 90 degrees as possible. Now, if you don't have a digital angle finder, no problem. You can also use a speed square or a carpenter square to accomplish this task. Because this is a beginner's how-to build, we won't be using a joiner. So to get a perfect edge, you need to buy S3S wood from your local wood shop. S3S just stands for surfaced on 3 sides. So the top, bottom, and one edge is planed out and ready to go. I ran the shop's edge along my fence, providing me with a perfectly straight side. Make sure to take your time here because if any edge is off by just a hair, it's going to cause a lot of headaches for gluing and sanding later in the build. After I had stripped the walnut and cherry to the desired width, I took them to my miter saw to cut them to length. The boards I am making today will be 16 inches long. For the accent pieces, I just bought these strips at my local woodworking shop. The white ones are strips of hard maple, and I got them at 1/8 of an inch thick by 3/4 inches wide. I then cut them to 16.5 inches. And these dark brown ones are walnut. Now I got these ones at 1/4 of an inch thick by 3/4 of an inch wide. Also cut those to 16.5. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take 2 of the hard maple and I'm going to put a walnut in between them. And this will give us our accent piece that we're going to put in between each piece of the walnut and cherry. Now, you can always strip these yourselves if you'd like to, but I prefer to just pick them up. It makes it easier. Once all of the pieces are stripped and cut to length, it's time to use our creativity and decide on the best looking pattern. Now, I don't have a creative bone in my body, so don't worry. If I can do it, so can you. And I always tell myself, if I think it looks good, then there has to be someone else out there that also thinks so. Once you have the pattern, you can roll the pieces onto one side and add your wood glue. My preferred choice is Titebond 3. If you go out looking for it, it's the one in the green bottle. Next, make sure you cover every single inch of the sides with glue. Even just a small gap can cause major problems down the road after it's been used a few times. One by one, place all of the pieces back in the same order and clamp them together. Do not over tighten them. You just need enough pressure to hold them together and to cause a small amount of squeeze out. If you over tighten them, you could squeeze everything out, causing your board to be weak. I'll be making 5 different boards for this video, so here are some of the additional patterns I went with. Now I wanted to show you that if you let these sit overnight and dry, the glue can be pretty hard to scrape off. So what I'm going to do is after 20 minutes, I'm going to come back to this one, flip it over and scrape off that excess glue. It's going to save you a ton of time, but because I let them dry earlier, I got to start scraping. Now I do have a planer, but I'm going to show you how I do the same thing by hand. However, you're going to need a few tools. A pencil, a mask, and a sander with multiple different types of grit sandpaper. You'll first start out by scribbling all over the board with a pencil and sand it down until the pencil marks are gone. You'll do this multiple times until you have worked through every piece of sandpaper. Oh, and you'll have to do both sides.
Like I said before, if you're just going to be making 1 or 2 cutting boards, you can totally get away with just using a hand sander. Now, I used my planer for 4 of these boards, and it only took me about 10 minutes to get all 4 of the cutting boards perfectly flat. However, the one I used my hand sander on, it took me about 20 minutes just for that single board. Again, if you want to do what I did, you don't need a planer. However, if you're like me and you sell a lot of these boards, you're gonna need one.
Now it's time for the final sanding. For this I used 120 grit and then sprayed each board with water. While the boards were drying, I thought I might as well do some other work, but you spray the boards because it will raise the grain, allowing the sandpaper to better smooth the surface. It'll also minimize the amount of water that the board will absorb. Once it's dried, take 220 grit sandpaper and finish it off. Next step is to trim the sides. Now, because the edges are straight, I used my carpenter square to line it up. And my goal was to take off as little material as possible. Once you have a solid line, you are able to take your skill saw and, using a speed square as a guide, trim it down.
Now, this is by far my least favorite way to cut your straight edge because there's a lot of room for error. So if you have a miter saw that you can do it on, do that. Or if you have a track saw, you can lay up the track saw and cut it through. This is just something that I know most people have, and so that's the way I'm going to be doing it. The last thing to do before it's ready for oil is to run it through the router. However, I'm going to be selling these to clients and they always ask for a personalized cutting board, so I took it to my friend's house who has a CNC machine and they engraved it for me. So just so you're aware, that's optional if you have that opportunity.
Routering the edge is also an optional step, but I highly recommend it because high quality cutting boards are used almost daily. And with all the wear and tear that they will accumulate, sharp corners can chip really easily, rendering the board useless. Plus, it makes it look good. I touch up the routed corners with a quick sanding. And finally, it's time for everybody's favorite part, adding the oil. It's always really rewarding to see a final project come to life. And seeing the final product is always worth the effort.
All right, I'm really happy with how these turned out. And so now all I'm gonna do is let them sit for a little while. I'll come back, flip them over, and put some more oil on. I hope this helped you out. If it did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.